My sincere apologies, I'm not there in person. So firstly, let me start that way. I know it's really difficult to listen to someone online, so I'm going to try to make this tight and precise. Firstly, I'm really glad you're having this conversation, that you're all here. Secondly, I want to sort of, one, it was just an honor to listen to actually the previous speaker. I was part of building the WikiHouse system in 2011, and it's traveled around the world, and it's just extraordinary to see. So that's firstly just acknowledging that. But more importantly, why I'm here is that I think the landscape of housing is shifting more fundamentally than we're acknowledging. So in terms of the carbon budget, I would just ask you, how much carbon budget do you think all of Europe has available for new housing? Just in the audience, how much budget do you think we have available? How many homes can we afford to build if we're going to stay in the Paris Accord? All of Europe. Rhetorical question because I can't hear you, but I'm going to give you, it is 144,000 homes a year across all of Europe. And I say that because I think it's just really interesting and important to understand that the systemic constraint that we're facing is we do no longer have the carbon budget available for many of the housing pledges and commitments that we're making. So if that's all of Europe, all of UK can afford to build 14,400 homes a year. And that excludes our capacity to retrofit, right? So if we retrofit, we're going to have to use that carbon budget to do that retrofitting. Now, so that's scenario one. Scenario two, in order to get the carbon budget down, which is currently, so if you use Denmark, which is running at industry averages 9.6 kilograms per meter squared per year of embodied carbon, well, full life cycle carbon, you need to get that down to 0.4. Industry average is 9.6 in Denmark. They are targeting getting it down to 7.6 now. That's been the new agreement. And we need to get it to 0.4. And just to give you an idea, the best schemes in Denmark, which is really running at this much harder than anywhere else, the best schemes, pretty much doing everything they can, are getting to 3.6 kilograms per meter per year. Now, why I say this, I think when you follow the numbers, you start to realize that we're going to face a fundamental disruption on our current industry and how we provide homes for people. And this has multiple implications and significant implications that I think many of us have likely been conveniently ignoring and going for marginal gains. Oh, I've reduced carbon by 10%. I've reduced carbon by 5%. I've reduced carbon by 20%. We're nowhere close to the numbers. Even a rammed earth wall doesn't get you to the numbers if you include the material supply chains, if you include the costs. So I think it's just really important, and I'd encourage all of you to just follow the numbers for a moment and see where this takes us. So that's system constraint number one. System constraint number two, everyone tells me, I'm building a timber house. And I'm saying, that's great. Where's your timber sourced? Certainly if you're in the UK, I know Ireland is different, but if you're in the UK, your timber is most likely sourced from outside the UK, because the UK does not have one managed timber forest for structural timber. Does not have one of them, which means that your timber supply chain is part of a global hydrocarbon-driven supply chain, which means if you follow the World Resources Institute, that there's a 5% variant between a timber house and effectively a concrete house, 5%. So in order to make these transitions, third, what we're going to have to do is if you build a timber house, please don't put timber on the outside of your buildings as sacrificial timber, because what are you going to do in terms of end-of-life management? How are you going to manage the end of life of that timber? You're going to burn it, you're going to release it. So how are we actually going to, if you use timber as a sequestration resource to store carbon, then you have to take responsibility for storing that carbon for 500 years, managing that life cycle of timber. We have not built the minerals economy and the material economy to effectively manage our material supply chains through those longevity structures. Next. It's very clear our comfort standards, basically, if you were to reduce and change our comfort standards, we could massively reduce the burden on our carbon intake. How we imagine that? Many of you are sitting here in shirts and other things. Well, what do? How much do we need heavily insulated buildings as a means to provide comfort? Are there other means to provide comfort? How do we construct that? Next, if we look at actually not just comfort, but you look at material oversupply, most of our buildings are vastly over-engineered in terms of the total material quantum, largely to prevent deflection and other things. So how do we reduce the materiality of our building becomes a key issue if we're going to reduce the carbon impact. How do we increase the utilization of our buildings? Massively. And in order to make that utilization happen, we're going to have to we're going to have to change a lot of our planning and building regs, which are single-use orientated. So how do you build a planning and regulatory framework which allows for durability of our buildings and to allow them to be programmed and reprogrammed over time? Next, everyone keeps talking about recyclable sort of materials which are circular. Denmark, which is one of the most circular economies, is less than 4% circular. So if we're going to build a material supply chain which is circular, the issue is not just materials, it's effectively the insurance and the material registries and the stewardships around that. Who owns those liabilities and those chains and ensures that material is the performance it was said. This requires a different form of material governance, which is going to be a key part of that story. So, and we could keep going down the chain. If you're going to be investing, we're almost certainly, I would suggest, certainly the conversations in other parts of the world are you are going to have to invest in either retrofit or critical shared infrastructures if we have a limited pool of carbon. Because we're going to have to increase the utilization of our homes and the care costs, certainly in parts of the UK and very parts of Northern Europe, means that we're going to almost certainly have to look at intergenerational living as a viable means to cover care costs. So if you start to look at the housing product from the system scale level, you start to think about it fundamentally differently. And then I think it's really critical we start to build the viable supply chains to effectively build the architecture and the built environment of the 21st century. And how do you build those supply chains which don't erode our soils? So monocultural forests, which are harvested, are really bad systemically for our soil management. So how do you support agroforestry? How do you manage agroforestry, which allows for harvesting of timber at 40-year cycles, then sequestering that carbon into the built environment? That is a completely different chain of experience. Now, I think one of the big questions that we're facing is how do we start to embrace this industry? How do you start to embrace the scale of change? And I think this is going to be one of the big, most structural changes of our built environment industry that we've seen. And it requires us to follow the numbers and work our way through and not pat ourselves, unfortunately, on the back for gaining marginal gains. Now, I know I've not been an uplifting speaker and I'm not sitting here going, yeah, we're going to do this. But that's not my point. My point here is that actually we're facing a structural transformation. Also, final point, maybe just to bear in mind, we're currently facing almost certainly 3 degrees temperature rise at a global average. Global average 3 degrees will mean we are looking at 5 degrees land temperatures and 8 to 10 degrees urban environments. Now, for the UK and Ireland, there's a very special circumstance, because if we lose the mid-Atlantic current, what we'll see is actually temperatures fall dramatically by maybe up to 20 degrees. So we have a problem that we are likely to see temperatures rise and then probably fall back in the current if we hit any of the tipping points. So we're going to have to deal with perhaps the risk of heating, overheating, and then actually not being able to afford the heating costs. That range problem is actually systemic and needs to be at the centerpiece of our retrofit thinking, rather than just actually operationalizing the stuff the way we currently do, which is looking backwards, saying what was the last 30 years of heating costs and how do you offset them. So, and cooling load is actually much more difficult to deliver and has lots of issues. And especially when you put all of this in the context of a consumer, certainly in the UK context, and I'm not aware sufficiently of Ireland, but in the UK context, the consumer doesn't have the capacity to absorb more energy and food environment costs. How do we start to actually build retrofits when actually we can't afford more debt on the system? Because most consumers can't afford more debt on the system. That's going to be one of the biggest issues. Finally, maybe my point here is that I think one of the other realities that we face, we often talk about housing affordability. How many people here, I can just about see you, so how many people here eat meat? Come on, guys, put your hands up. Right, thank you. So a €5 piece of meat, actually, if you were to price in social and environmental costs fully, costs €28. Okay? €5 meat costs €28. My shirt, which is effectively a £45 shirt, if you were to price in social and environmental costs, costs between £250 to £450. Now, my third question, if you were to truly price in social and environmental costs on your housing and the development of new housing, what's the price of a house? And I think one of the big problems that we face is we're going to face a 5 to 10x rise in our material costs as we start to internalize these social and environmental costs. And that is going to shift our theory of what is affordable and what is a viable use of our material stock in our economy. And I say all this stuff because I think these are the forces that are going to transform our built environment. And remember, if we don't do that and we keep externalizing costs, actually what we're creating is an environment which basically self-terminates, i.e. we're on a pathway where, at 1.7 to 1.9 degrees, we'll certainly lose one of the major food baskets, all the way through to all the other climate issues that are well recognized by the IPCC. So I suppose my intro here is that, and my wish here is that we start to look and follow the numbers and start to really talk about what this requires, which requires a new material economy, which requires a new way of dealing with biomaterials, which requires us to reimagine what affordability will look like in a new sort of age where the cost can no longer be externalized. And how do you build spatial justice in that way? If we are going to use our limited resources, where do we use them? Do we use them to build new housing stock in the middle of nowhere? Or do we use them to effectively intensify shared use, build shared infrastructure facilities which release private space and allow it to be used? If we are going to use some of our existing carbon stock, do we use it to build super lightweight material uses with the lowest impact? How do we do that? How do we build the circular supply chains that everyone talks about and make it mandatory in terms of actually the material infrastructure? Those are the hard questions that are facing us. And I think it's great that you're all here. I'm sincerely sorry that I'm not there in person because I think, as you can probably tell, it's a really important conversation for me as well. And finally, I'd say, if I've got something wrong, please do email me and let me know. I'm working with the best available knowledge that I have and happy to have kind of more nuanced debates. And we're working with, various partners from Crown Estates to housing associations in London and the UK. So this isn't coming from an abstract academic space. It's coming from actually understanding what the real issues are when you get closer to the ground. So thank you so much for your time. And I wish you a fantastic day. And like I say, I'm happy to take any form of email questions and any form of debate that would be useful. Thank you, my friends.